Commodore tries to get into the retail business. Atari announces plans to release a 16-bit console. And Interplay hits hard times. These stories and more on this month's episode of the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine.
I've been waiting a long time for a chance to say this. Stop the presses.
Requiescat in pace.
What is up? It's me, Mario.
Please save me.
Welcome to the January 2019 episode of the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine. I'm your host, Carl Kouros, and I'll be looking at what was making news in the video game industry this month, 40, 30, and 20 years ago. As always, I'll mostly be using magazine cover dates for the 20 and 30-year jumps, while relying on newspaper articles and historical documents for the 40-year jump, as there weren't many dedicated gaming publications on the market yet. So, without any further ado, let's jump back to January 1979. This month, the big news is the Winter CES in Las Vegas, the Consumer Electronics Show. And no better place to start than, of course, Ray Kassar, the newly minted president and CEO of Atari. Now, right before he headed out to Las Vegas to show off Atari's first home computers, the 400 and the 800, he gave an interview to the New York Times. Interestingly enough, in that interview, he didn't just talk about, oh, cool, we've got a home computer. He was already thinking much, much bigger. And he mentions that Warner Brothers, through its cable division, was already running an experimental interactive TV system in Columbus, Ohio. Now, the article doesn't go any deeper into this, but I did some checking, and what he was referring to was called the Cube Cable TV System. Cube, Q-U-B-E. Now, the Cube system was actually quite cool because in addition to a bunch of additional functions, it also allowed for real-time feedback during live broadcasts. So they had this big controller with all the channels listed on it, but you also had buttons 1 through 5. And they allowed you to answer multiple choice questions. This was used for a variety of things, for example, game shows, where people would be asked, what do you think our viewers think is the best answer? And the people would then have to guess what the viewers at home had entered into their device. Very interesting system. More importantly, though, it also gave us Nickelodeon and MTV both spring out of the Cube system. So these specialty channels of one type of programming, kids programming, music, and so forth. And the Cube system also allowed for the first time pay-per-view, where you paid, it got billed to you, and you could then unlock a specific show that would have otherwise been scrambled. Now, all of that's fine and good, and you're wondering, well, why are we talking about cable television? We're talking about computers. Well, Kassar is basically trying to connect the two. He's saying that you might be able to network the computers together using this cable system for the delivery of all sorts of entertainment. Of course, this is 1979, so it's pretty daring to be looking forward at this kind of a network setup on a consumer level, and the fact that Warner Brothers is already doing this, and that there's the thought of synergies between the different divisions of the corporation is pretty kick-ass and would have actually been amazing. Kassar then goes on to talk about how the home electronics market is simply going to explode over the next 5 years. Well, yeah, the crash would happen within the next 5 years, so he was kind of right that it would explode. I don't think that was the metaphor he was going for, though. And that this was only going to be the tip of the iceberg. Very interesting on top of that is that Jeffrey A. Rocklis, and probably massacring the name, Rochlis, R-O-C-H-L-I-S. If somebody knows how to pronounce the gentleman's name, please send me a comment. Now, he is the president of Mattel Electronics. He's also at the CES. And he gives very interesting little bit of insight maybe into what Mattel was already planning. And that he said that if you have a video game system, it gets you 90% of the way to a home computer. This is, of course, in the backdrop of home computers becoming a bigger and bigger issue. We had the triumvirate of 77 with Commodore, Radio Shack, and Apple. Got Atari coming in now with two extremely powerful machines. And what's not said here, and what wasn't public yet, was that Mattel was already working on the Intellivision. In 1979, they would test market it in Fresno, California, before doing a nationwide launch in 1980. So clearly Mattel is already thinking of this. Unfortunately, it would be quite a few more years, I believe 83 or 84, before Mattel would launch the Aquarius home computer system, which was an extremely underpowered, essentially a little more than a toy, home computer entry, a little bit too late to have any impact. But it's interesting that the president of Mattel Electronics is already thinking in those terms, that the video game systems are simply a jumping off point to get to home computers, which also might explain why Atari isn't really thinking that much at this moment about the next generation of their video game hardware. They're simply thinking, well, we started with the 2600, now we're going to go to home computers, and well, that's the evolution of this. In addition to that, Everett T. Meserve, again, I'm probably killing this guy's name, he's a consultant at Arthur D. Little Incorporated, is predicting a 1 billion, that's with a B, home computer business by 1982. And I couldn't confirm the numbers, but from all the estimates I have been able to find, it's not far off. In news unrelated to CES, there is an interesting notice, and I followed this over several newspapers and several articles. Lafayette Radio Electronics Corporation. It is being targeted by Commodore for a takeover. Now, you probably never heard of Lafayette Radio Electronics Corporation, and I hadn't either up until this point. But they were a maker and retailer of electronics, including CB radios and television components. Now, they went all the way back to the 1930s, and at this point in time, they're basically the direct competition to Radio Shack. They were in many parts of the country, and the United States, mind you, they were far more well represented than Radio Shack. Radio Shack had been picked up by Tandy Corporation, Tandy Leather Company. What's it actually with leather companies buying up electronic stores? We saw the same thing with Connecticut Leather, aka Coleco. But okay, Tandy bought Radio Shack in 1963. And aggressively expanded the chain. So Lafayette was actually already quite well established. They had both catalog and retail store outlets. They were very well represented across the country, and what had happened to them was that they kind of missed the boat on the CB radio craze. So anybody who remembers the classic movie Smokey and the Bandit, where everybody apparently had a CB radio, well, this had to do with the fact that in 1977, the Federal Communications Commission, that's the regulatory agency in the United States that controls things like broadcast television and radio and CB radios, expanded the public citizen band radio channels from 23 to 40. What this meant was that a whole bunch more people could be talking at the same time. Now, unfortunately, Lafayette apparently didn't get the memo that this was coming. They had a ton of backstock of CB radios that only worked on the 23 original available channels. They were not ready to hit the market with a 40-channel option, and it basically killed them. So at this point in 1979, Commodore is making a bid to buy up Lafayette. Now they're doing it in somewhat technical terms. I don't want to get too much into this, but it's basically they're going to finance some of the debt of the company through debentures. Now this is a way of basically saying, yeah, we'll pay for this at some point. And I know the finance guys out there are going to be like, no, that's not right. It's close enough. And Commodore was quite well known for these kind of tactics, leveraging debt and so forth in order to take over suppliers and competitors. Now, on the January 3rd article on this topic in the New York Times just tells us that Commodore is a maker of electronic consumer goods and metal office furniture. And my first thought was, I know the PET was heavy, but that seems a bit mean. But it is true. Commodore actually had a very thriving office furniture division that was running primarily in Canada at that point. And they offered to issue subordinated debentures to the company. Now, according to an article the next day in the newspaper, so January 4th, Commodore made the announcement of their takeover deal apparently without consulting Lafayette's management, who had not reviewed it yet and had no comment on it. Again, typical Trammell move to put pressure on a possible acquisition. And then the deal would burst within 2 weeks. Lafayette was already in heavy negotiation with its creditors at this point. And they would end up filing for bankruptcy in 1981, so they made it a little bit longer. And they would ultimately disappear as a going concern. The name Lafayette would get resurrected a couple more times over the next 2 decades, but basically the original company dies in 81. Of course, this seems like a non-starter, but the fact that Commodore even contemplated this, tried to get their own retail chain, is pretty amazing, because that would have put them one-to-one with Tandy's Radio Shack. Because remember, Tandy at this time is making great inroads simply due to the fact that if people wanted to buy a computer, they had to go to a store, and Radio Shack had nationwide advertising. The locations were easy to find. Being able to just pick up a Tandy at a store with specialty people there was a lot easier than trying to find a computer retailer back then who was selling you a Commodore, or going to a mass retailer where the people probably didn't know what they were talking about. So, interesting little side note, a dead end, but interesting history nonetheless. Our final story from January of 1979 is about Atari opening up a production facility in Ireland. Now, this comes to us primarily out of the Atari Coin Connection magazine. This was their newsletter to arcade operators, and they talked about how they were starting up a production facility in Europe in order to supply that market. It makes a lot of sense when you think about the fact that an arcade cabinet is essentially a giant empty wooden box for the most part, with just some boards in it and the monitor. Most of the space is empty, and transporting that back and forth across the ocean is a lot of expense for no good reason. Also, the tariffs and everything else that got implemented on it would have just pushed the prices up. So they got a lot of money from the Irish government to settle in Tipperary, and they opened up a factory there in 1979. Now, this facility would continue to operate through the boom years until 1984, when the market crashed. And at that point, Atari managed to save the facility by signing a 5-year deal with Namco. So the facility would now build both Namco and Atari cabinets. After the Namco deal ended, Atari continued to produce units there, but it wasn't going all that well. By 1995, Midway would take over the plant, but that also wouldn't last. A year later, in 1996, Namco would actually take it over full time. 2 years later, in 1998, the plant would finally close and cease operations. So, not too shabby, almost 2 decades of building arcade cabinets in Tipperary. That concludes our time in January of 1979. Let's turn up the time machine and jump forward to January 1989. Let's start off in Europe, where Rare is announcing that they're going to get into the arcade hardware business with the Raz board. Now, the board specs were pretty interesting, as it used a souped-up version of the Z80 processor, which was the same chip that was powering European computers like the Spectrum and the Amstrad CPC, as well as Japanese systems like the MSX and Master System. This may not have been necessarily the best choice for arcade board in 1989, but they added a whole bunch of graphic chips, allowing for a bunch of graphical sprite trickery, and between 500K and 1 meg of RAM, which would give the board some muscle. Now, if this sounds at all familiar, it's because just last month we talked about how Mastertronic, around the same time, announced plans to release arcade games using the Amiga hardware. So taking home specs, souping them up maybe a little bit, and launching games into the arcades. In some ways, it seems to be the European home video game developers' response to the fact that the 8-bit home computers were dying out. The Japanese consoles hadn't really gotten a strong foothold in the European market, and the two 16-bit home computers, the Amiga and the Atari ST, were having some success but weren't quite the big money-making powerhouses that the 8-bits had been for them. Now, Rare takes this one step further by enlisting some really well-known name talent to work on games for the Rasboard. First one is John Rittman. Now, Rittman was famous for the Matchday games published by Ocean. These were soccer simulations that basically were the gold standard for footy games on the Spectrum and Amstrad for a very long time. And he was also pretty well known for creating some isometric games such as Batman and Head Over Heels for Ocean. This actually was kind of, the thing that made the headlines in Ace Magazine issue 16 that month. The other games in development for the system, less spectacular. Simon Hallam, a longtime industry veteran, was making a shooter game with biplanes, and Flea Pit, which was being developed by the Pickford brothers, again, another English developer duo with a lot of history. They were working on a game that would never see the light of day as an arcade title, but would end up getting developed further for the Super Nintendo and be launched as Plok. You may be wondering, wait, I don't remember the Rasboard. Well, the Rasboard never did come out. It seems to be that for whatever reason, this whole project just wasn't getting off the ground, but Rare was never one to simply leave good tech lying around, and it ended up getting reworked into a handheld game prototype called the Playboy. Now, this device is actually still on display at the Rare Studios. You can actually take a look at it. There's an interesting article from redbull.com, of all places, going into a bit of the history of the system, and they even showed it around a little bit at the CES later that year, at the same time that Nintendo was showing off the original Game Boy. Now, the Playboy was going to actually have a color monitor and all these fun graphical sprites, but as soon as Rare saw that Nintendo was getting into this business, that Nintendo had a device that was small, cheap, easy, they immediately dropped the plans for their own handheld and were one of the primary developers for the Game Boy Second Party. That relationship would then, which was already strong with Nintendo, would continue to blossom over the next few years. So, another tale of what could have been. Speaking of which, Atari in January of 1989 has also announced that they want to release a console version of their ST computer line. They also wanted to show off a portable version of the machine to a select few at Comdex, but nothing ever came of that. Now, the company was trying to find its footing at this point. The Lynx was right around the corner. That was going to come out. But at the same time, they could see that this console thing was back. They knew that they had to do something with consoles, and the Atari ST system seemed like the natural fit. Now, for those of you not in the know on the history of this, Atari, of course, had the classic 2600 and all their other systems, but in 1987, they had converted their original 8-bit line of computers that were started back in 79, we just talked about those, into a game system, the XEGS. Now, this was compatible with virtually all the software that had come before. You could expand it with a keyboard, but it primarily used cartridges for the games. And this system, while not a huge mover and shaker, had given Atari again some legitimacy, some experience in the market, and a presence again at retail. So 2 years later, it just seems natural to take the Atari ST hardware, which at this point was also now 4 or 5 years old, and try to turn that into a console. This would have been a 16-bit console launched at the same time as the Genesis. Would it have been as powerful as the Genesis? Definitely not. But if you consider the options of being able to take all of the existing ST software libraries, popping them onto cartridges and eliminating the load times in the process, and maybe working out some other technical kinks, it may have been an actual contender for some kind of placement in the market. Unfortunately, beyond this one mention of the system in the Games Machine magazine, nobody else seems to know anything about this. It just sort of came, went, disappeared. Another could have been. In news that's actually going someplace, Colleen Beck, the famous designer behind Defender of the Crown, has left Cinemaware and is now at Electronic Arts working on a little title tentatively known as Caesar. Now, this would go on to be developed as Centurion, Defender of Rome, one of my all-time favorite games, a game that I still actually go back to every couple of years. And does it have a great historical value that I'm mentioning this? No, but anytime I get a chance to talk about Centurion, Defender of Rome, I consider it worthy. So, if you haven't played the game before, think of it as a late 80s, early 90s version of Rome Total War with slightly less complexity, but just as much fun. Okay, now, our final bit of news from January of 1989 is that Interplay is breaking away from their publishing deal with Electronic Arts. Now, Interplay was a development studio that had long been publishing its games through Electronic Arts, but now they've decided to self-publish in the United States. They'd still be using EA for their distribution in Europe. Brian Fargo, the founder of the company, dismissed the idea of producing Bard's Tale 4 or Wasteland 2, as they would be EA titles. So they're leaving, but those publishing rights are still with them. Quote that he gave to Computer and Video Games: "If we were to bring out sequels, then we're just giving games to our rivals." Of course, Brian Fargo would be involved with both Bard's Tale 4 and Wasteland 2 decades later through crowdfunding initiatives, but that's another story that, if this show runs long enough, we may or may not get to. So, the first independent products of the company are Battle Chess and Neuromancer, which the latter based on the famous William Gibson novel. Interplay has broken free of EA's stranglehold. With that being said, let's leave January 1989 and go to January 1999. And we start off our 1999 retrospective with Interplay is Seeing Red. 10 years after going solo, the firm is hemorrhaging cash, according to Next Generation magazine. They've laid off up to 50 people, merged at least 2 internal operations, canceled their high-level project Vulcan. Now, I'm guessing that what the magazine is referring to is The Secret of Vulcan Fury, a highly anticipated Star Trek game which would also be the last one to unite all of the original cast members, and lost $15 million in the most recent quarter, with more losses ahead. Now, Interplay would end up in bankruptcy court shortly after this and turn their financial fortunes around by going public. That massive public infusion of cash gave them enough money to really change the company's prospects. Ultimately, though, the attempts to break into the lucrative console market would fail, and it would get absorbed by the French publisher Titus a few years later. Interplay today still exists, although it's pretty much just a renamed version of Titus that has survived until today. Now, in happier news, the Argentine magazine Next Level informs us that Square will be creating a fully rendered movie epic, Final Fantasy: The Movie. Now, Columbia, the international distributor, is happy to jump on the hype train created by Final Fantasy VII, and Hironobu Sakaguchi, man, today is really my day for killing names, isn't it? The film's director and president of Square USA is hoping to create a brand new form of entertainment. Now, Sadly, what would end up coming out of this Final Fantasy movie project, released in 2001, would only gross $85 million worldwide, which was far short of the $137 million production budget. Final Fantasy The Spirits Within, I can tell you out of first-hand experience, having sat in the movie theater on opening weekend, was an absolute cluster of a movie. Made virtually no sense. It was depressing as hell. There wasn't a chocobo in sight. It was just kind of like, what the hell were they thinking? For the time, it looked quite pretty, although the uncanny valley effect of almost all the characters' eyes was a bit unsettling. But it was an interesting first step, and the financial blow would lead ultimately to Square having to merge with Enix to form Square Enix. In other news, VM Labs has announced that they have a name for their new gaming hardware. Now, VM Labs at this point was a company founded and partially staffed by former Atari employees, and their new console system, up until now always talked about as Project X, will be called Nuon. Now, if you're one of those people who has never heard of Nuon before, congratulations, you're in the majority. Now, Nuon ended up actually being a chipset that was added to DVD players. And what it would do would be unlock additional functionalities like 3D menus and things like that on DVDs, and could also play 3D games on the DVD player. And unfortunately, it was not very successful. It only ended up having 8 games released using the chipset. Now, several manufacturers made Nuon enhanced DVD players, but none of them caught on. Now, this was, of course, an interesting idea, especially for a company like VM Labs that was never going to be able to manufacture their own hardware the same way Sony could do, or Nintendo, or Sega, or any of those. To be able to piggyback on existing devices like DVD players wasn't a bad idea. Unfortunately, they're a couple years too early. The DVD craze would really only get going once Sony launched the PlayStation 2. And then, of course, well, you bought a cheap DVD player in the PlayStation 2 and you could already play games that were probably going to be much more powerful than what the new one could do. An interesting concept, but unfortunately this is turning into the episode of Technological Evolution Dead Ends. Then, talking about that, at the Tokyo Game Show, 2 new handheld devices are being shown off, the WonderSwan and the Neo Geo Pocket. Now, the crowded handheld market at this point was already being dominated by the Game Boy. Pokemon had just gotten its North American release. Its follow-up, the Game Boy Color, was already on the market. The Game Gear was actually still in production. The Sega Nomad, which was a portable version of the Genesis, would still be on the market for 1 more year. And now we're getting 2 new entries into this marketplace. The Gunpei Yokoi, the legendary designer of the Game & Watch and the Game Boy, and infamously the Virtual Boy, had left Nintendo after the fiasco that was the Virtual Boy, and instead created his own company, and that company's design was the WonderSwan. It was a black and white handheld similar to the Game Boy, but with a much higher resolution. It had amazing battery life, and it would only be released in Japan. Now, it did have some functionality and compatibility with the Sony PlayStation Pocket Station, which was the little VMU miniature playable cartridge plug-in thing for the PlayStation, which also would only get released in Japan. But it did give you a little bit of back and forth and compatibility in that sense. The device didn't last very long on the market, would later on get a WonderSwan Color update, but again, Japan-only product with not much reach. The Neo Geo Pocket, on the other hand, was shown in two variants right from the get-go, a color one and a black and white one. The resolution was far closer to the Game Boy, although it was higher than the Game Boys. The system would get an international release, at least for the color variant, which would get released in North America and Europe. It would also get really solid ports of SNK fighting games, usually in a chibi form, so it was basically the same characters from Art of Fighting and Samurai Showdown, but squatted down, but still quite playable, as well as playable Metal Slug games and franchise crossover card battling titles, which really just took on an almost mythic level of cult fandom online. So if you look up, you'll still find a lot of people enjoying those card games for the Neo Geo Pocket. Sadly, neither system would last very long, a couple of years at most, and then be discontinued. On a much happier note, there's a 2-page preview of the Hired Guns remake in Next Generation magazine. Now, for those of you who have not had the pleasure of playing the original Hired Guns in all its Amiga 500 glory, let me explain a little bit about why this is something that's even making the radar of this show. Hired Guns was a little game by DMA Design, the same people who gave us Lemmings and Grand Theft Auto. It was a 4-player split-screen, real-time sci-fi dungeon crawler with nothing but a co-op mode. So what you would end up with is a team of 4 mercenaries in a sci-fi setting, each one of them with a first-person, 90-degree turn, block at a time, dungeon crawl movement method, who would then have to coordinate with one another. Now remember, this is the early 90s, so you're not dealing with network. You've got 4 people crammed around a 14-inch CRT, 2 people on the keyboard, 2 people with joystick and mouse, trying to work together while you're all screaming at each other because, well, somebody fell in the shark tank or there's the weird cyborg dogs attacking you, trying to get through level after level of this weird alien world. Unbelievable experience, a very unique one that those of us who had the pleasure of playing it back in the day sort of always look back on extremely fondly. Now, the fact that a DMA Design spin-off studio, Devil's Thumb Entertainment, was undertaking this new effort, using the then still fairly new Unreal Engine, it would offer up to 8 players simultaneously over a LAN. All the different character classes and everything else were being promised to be in the game again, was just music to our ears. On a fun little side note, at the time I was running a website called Trantor's Amicrypt, and I actually got exclusively, a couple months before these previews hit the magazines, the exclusive first screenshots leaked to me from one of the developers of the game. I was so proud of this. When he told me they were making a new Hired Guns, I was like, hallelujah. So yeah, Hired Guns remake, it looked amazing. We were all hyped about it, and then the project sadly died. Devil's Thumb Entertainment either couldn't finish it, something happened, and the game died on the vine, unfortunately. The studio would never produce another game. They would get sold off to a company called VR1, and that would be the last time we heard anything coming about from the Hired Gun franchise. So, on that note, let's end this month's journey through the history of video gaming news, turn off the time machine, and go back about our business until we're back here 30 days from now for another episode of the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine. If you liked the show, please remember to subscribe in your app of choice. Also remember to tell your friends about it and leave a comment. If you have any questions for me, you can follow me on Twitter at Video Game Newsroom Time Machine or on Facebook at Video Game Newsroom Time Machine. Or email me at, you guessed it, videogamenewsroomtimemachine@gmail.com. Until next time, have fun.